Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the STEM in Education series. My name is Jonathan Richards and I am the founder of the EdTech Spot. Today, myself and STEM/CTE educator Mr. Jelani Payne will be your host. Now, before we get this show rolling, I want you to let us know where you're from in the comments or live chat session. Feel free to leave your name and social media handle as well. Now, throughout this series, we have been promoting STEM as a way of thinking, giving examples of use for the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels that can be used in the blended learning environment. In addition, laying out the conditions required in the covert approach. This covert approach, which is the lesser known of the three approaches advocated, asks that we carefully consider the context and conditions that students must thrive in. It begins with giving your students a choice. The choice of a project or an assignment must be genuine and not just two or three options designated. This really does not benefit the learner. The student choice should be the freedom to organize, structure, present their ideas, and learning in the classroom. The second one is ownership. When you give your students genuine choice, then there will be genuine interest in the learning opportunities, which leads to ownership. Let them choose tools to build, engage, motivate, and become self-regulated. Give your students a voice. Genuine choice and ownership will lead to a desire to show others what they have created, developed, or discovered. This experience is transformative because it points to what the learner has learned and how it has made their work or world different in some way. And finally, provide authentic experiences through STEM learning. Let them select projects that can become real life solutions in their world. These three approaches are our recommendations in response to the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic to the education system. While many schools and districts have adopted some of these approaches, there exists concerns on the management of tools, resources, and modalities of learning. This is where I turn to our guests to get a sense of where we are in response to these challenges during the pandemic. Here to give us perspective is Mr. Chad Monerville. Now, Chad is an adjunct lecturer at the UWI Open Campus. That's the University of the West Indies Open Campus, and the former CARICOM Youth Ambassador for Barbados. So welcome to the EdTech Spot. Chad, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Jonathan. I look forward to the dialogue today.
Yes, it's great having you here, Chad. Now, Chad, this pandemic has challenged us to provide alternative ways of delivering instructional learning. Officials across the world have implemented the now popular blended learning environment, but are faced with complaints about their style of implementation. There are genuine public pains of inequity of access, inadequate stakeholder involvement, and school capacity to facilitate social distancing policies. So, in retrospect, what is your response or thoughts on how officials have handled the reopening of schools locally and regionally?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I think one of the most important things that we have to consider is that the COVID-19 is quite novel, and therefore these are unpredictable and certainly unprecedented times here in Barbados and across the region. So any response in itself is very new. So I won't be too harsh upon what the policymakers have implemented, simply to say that any response requires dialogue, it requires meaningful engagement with the stakeholders. And I think for the large part, that is what we've had in Barbados. And we're seeing the benefits. Yes, we understand that there are inequities. And certainly as a caring society, many persons in Barbados would have reached out to those persons who are the less fortunate, who didn't have the access to the technology, who didn't, whether it be the physical technologies such as the laptops and the tablets and so on. And even we've seen corporate Barbados, even the telecommunications companies, also stepping up and playing their part in terms of getting that vital communications and internet to those who need it at this point in time. Overall, I think the response has been efficient, given the context that we are facing. As I said, it's very novel, and therefore we are learning as we go about the implementation of this response. Yes, in anything that is new, there will be teething problems that we need to address. And for the large extent, there has been listening. We have engaged stakeholders, and I think generally speaking across Barbados and across the region, we've done well for the most part. You've seen certainly in Trinidad, you would have seen the Minister of Education also engaging the parents and the students, letting them know that, hey, we are all facing this together. And I think that's perhaps the hallmark that we need to recognize, is that yes, COVID-19 has come about. We certainly didn't ask for it, but we are adapting, and that is the most important thing at this point in time, the ability to adapt. And I think we, within the CARICOM block, has done pretty well in that adaptation.
Yes, I can say you're right that it is a new experience for us having to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. And at first, we were thrown into that online remote emergency learning environment. But now that we've adopted the blended learning environment and have that time to prepare for our current reality, would you say that educators are now better prepared to face the challenges in the classroom? And is there adequate access to continuous professional development opportunities post the inception training that our educators would have received?
That's a very good question, Jonathan. I think one of the things that we need perhaps to educate the viewers on is that Barbados is perhaps one of the few Caribbean countries that was visionary in this whole adaptation and adoption of ITC into our schools. Certainly for those who are knowledgeable about Barbados and its education, would be aware of a program called Adjunct, launched many years ago. And that was because we recognized that the world was changing. Yes, persons can argue that perhaps we haven't had the implementation that we would have want at this point in time, but certainly the basis and the foundation is there. And the other point is that we in Barbados are one of the few CARICOM countries that are fortunate to have a teacher training school, which is the Erdeston Teachers Training School, which has a mandate to build out teacher training, ensure that teachers are updated and upskilled on the pedagogy required for the times. And we've been doing that. We've been doing that to make sure that at the end of the day, teachers in Barbados are well equipped to deal with the challenges presented. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But certainly we are working assiduously to make sure that in its totality, children in Barbados, those in education, and certainly parents can rest assured that optimal education is being delivered.
Yes, and it is clearly seen that there needs to be a shift, or there has been a shift in the role of educators in learning. In light of this fact, many educators had to develop coping mechanisms to deal with the challenges in this new tech integrated classrooms. So, do you also see it necessary to include some sort of resilience building exercises in our teacher training, and why?
Yeah, most definitely. When you for those who have been privy to what teachers are trained, particularly those qualified teachers, you would get to understand that the curriculum that they are undergo is quite rigorous to become a qualified teacher, and some of the things within that curriculum speaks also to resilience, speaks to adapting to the times, speaks to applying certainly applying new mechanisms and new technologies to adapt to each and every child. At Erdeston, I am aware that we've built out our literacy center to make sure that for every child, even if you have a learning deficiency, that literacy center can cater to you. I am aware that we've also built out our education leadership program to make sure that all teachers have the ability to aspire to to higher heights, within still staying within the teaching capacity, and also to make sure that they can deal with the rigors of life. We understand that children are very diverse. Children are not a one size fits all, and therefore teachers, in very sense, have to be able to adapt. And that again, I stress that that is perhaps the most important thing. And therefore, the adaptation requires a level of resilience in teachers. So it is not lost upon the fact that teachers require that level of resilience. And certainly, we are working assiduously to build that within the teaching profession.
Yes, I agree. And I also want to highlight here that a part of the challenge, especially for governments, was trying to find timely evidence based solutions that would meet the needs of who would have been directly or indirectly impacted by the new educational policies. So, going forward, Chad, how should our policymakers engage stakeholders, and what best practices should the Caribbean region adopt to ensure that our policies are better informed or qualified?
That's a very, very good question, and certainly right across the world, persons have been looking at how can we transform education from a policy level. And perhaps the first thing that I will start with is the OECD published, I think it was 2019, when they published a report which spoke about transforming education. And one of the things that underscored, or one of the things that they linked transforming education to, is like they compare transforming education to like moving graveyards. It is very, you need to understand that it will not happen overnight, and it is very, very, you need to continuously work at it. And that work requires these stakeholders, because one of the things that that study found was that there were persons who were comfortable within the current system, and those persons who were comfortable were the persons who were very much against change, were very much against the rejuvenation or the new look education. And the United Nations said it quite well when they did their study on the Sustainable Development Goals. They linked the factors why a lot of the goals weren't moving as it should is because the education system was not aligned to the modern economies and the modern skills and jobs required. So the first thing that I will say from an educational policy perspective is simply that we need to engage the stakeholders, and we need to do so from a position whereby we understand that persons have been in the industry for a very long time, and they may be against the change, but we need to look at it from the overall perspective. So in terms of advocating for policy and the change in policy, I would say that the first thing we need to do is come from that perspective, or we need to engage the stakeholders. Yes, we need to also build capacity building, both for the teachers and both for the policymakers, because we need to make sure that within this new education that we're infusing ICT practices, particularly blended learning. And one of the things that I may speak of, really, because it's very dear to my heart in my former capacity as CARICOM Youth Ambassador for Barbados. Um, Viewers should be aware that my education development team, which Jonathan was also a part of, and program coordinator, led quite brilliantly to present a proposal to the Ministry of Education, which sought to implement the blended learning platform into the primary schools in Barbados as a sample and then roll out. Perhaps quite visionary, that we are now in this COVID time and it's now the order of the day. Um, but that is something that also needs to be replicated right across the region. Again, the other thing which needs to inform the policy is the need for ICT applications and services, which also, as I alluded to before, the software and the hardware, and equally the technical support. And that is one of the things that I'm proud of that at Erdeston we are doing. We are calling out teachers from classrooms and upskilling and training them with the required skills necessary to deliver in the blended environment. Certainly, those will be aware as well that the ministry also has persons who who their mandate is to provide persons with that training, so that the teachers are well equipped to provide. So, in the real sense, Barbados has been very, very visionary. Uh, Perhaps we can also say ahead of the curve for the large extent, but it is no instance where we need to continue on the current trajectory and perhaps even ramp that up. But conscious of the fact that it needs to be done in a block, the CARICOM block, and therefore we need to make sure that everyone is well equipped to move at the same speed. And hence why capacity building is so important as we engage stakeholders, not only in Barbados, but right across the region.
Yes, I love that you emphasize on capacity building, teacher training, because there needs to be some sort of continuous professional development, not just at the initial stages, but continue through if we want to see our ITC policies successful in the long run. For this next question, I'll ask Mr. Jelani Payne and Mr. Dwayne Matthews, a Canadian educational strategist and the founder of Tomorrow Now Labs, to join this discussion. All right. So I'll start with you, Dwayne, for this question. In the Caribbean, what type of policies, and I know you already mentioned this, but if there are any further policies, but what other types of policies you would like to see implemented that would better prepare our educational systems to cope or manage crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic?
So thank you very much for having me. And I want to say I really enjoyed Chad's comments about the type of visionary approach that Barbados is taking. And I would love to see a lot more of the Caribbean. Yeah, there is an echo. I'd love to see a lot more of the Caribbean follow through with taking some of these visionary approaches. I think one of the most important things is creating a policy framework that allows for different experiments. Chad alluded to the fact that, an incumbent structure, the incumbent structure of teachers are going to have a difficult time in terms of making adjustments. If you have a certain amount of, emotional and professional investment in the system as it is, and you know that change will take away some of that, remove the gate, if you will, you're going to be significantly more resistant. And that's not, something that's specific to education in the Caribbean. It's not something that's specific to education. It's specific to any incumbent structure. So typically there's a great thinker by the name of Clayton Christensen. And one of the things that he talks about in terms of incumbent structures and disrupting incumbent structures is having smaller sort of vehicles that sit outside the incumbent structure. And those vehicles have a benchmark or milestones, and they can be almost put out. The best way for me to visualize it is if you can imagine that you're on the Titanic and you see an iceberg, you pull to the right and you realize that there's more icebergs. The best idea is not to rip apart the ship and rebuild it while it's in the water. The best idea is to put as many dinghies as possible into the water to navigate that space. And so you really have to start creating these sort of environments or these opportunities where you can have smaller educational vehicles that are really sort of experimental, but they do have a milestone and they have a benchmark that they have to meet with, and then you can put those out and see how those are and examine those as you go.
Yes, Dwayne. Now, you recently had the opportunity to engage the ears and the eyes of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So tell us more about what policies you were able to share, and you just tell us about the policies that you were able to share and the desired policies you'd like to see in the future from that meeting.
Sure, and the conversation that we had was a brief conversation, but what we really talked about was how do we, instead of thinking about going back to school, how do we think about going forward to school, and how do we meet with the opportunity? And one of the best ways to do that is to look out into the future and find a common north. What is the common north that we're moving towards? So a lot of times, we think about incremental improvements to big incumbent structures, which makes sense because the incumbent structures are designed to be very stable. But as we look out and we want to make some kind of a transformation, we have to get a real clear sight on what is the goal. And once we have an idea of what the goal is, then we'll get an idea of what the challenges are and the root causes of those challenges. And then we can create individual experiments or iterations that we can measure as we go. Typically, what happens in a lot of education systems around the world, people tend to take a new technology or new technological approach and substitute it for something that's already there. So it's not really transformative. It may be, hey, we were writing on paper, we're writing our notes on paper, so now we're typing our notes into a Google Doc. If you think about it, it's not really a transformation. Once digital, the improvement is incremental, but it's not transformational. So how do you start looking at, where is it that we're going? And so understanding where we're going is to have a real clear sight, I think, of the fourth industrial revolution and what the potential of that fourth industrial revolution brings. What is the downside? And more importantly, what is the upside? So I believe that places like the Caribbean have a substantial advantage over larger places because of their size and because they have the access to a lot of the resources, and to get access to a lot of the resources, it's a lot easier to scale as opposed, it's a lot easier to scale Trinidad and Tobago at 1.3 million people than it is to scale the United States at 350 million people, right? So it really creates an opportunity. And I think if we look at it from an opportunity perspective while we manage downside, we'll start to see that it is actually a very exciting time.
Yes, that is definitely a conversation that we hope to have here in Barbados and in the Caribbean region as well, Dwayne, with our policymakers. And I just want to highlight that Dwayne, although he's a Canadian, he's also a Caribbean man as well, with roots in Trinidad. So when he speaks to you, he's speaking, having an understanding of, what we are facing and the education system that we have in the Caribbean system as well. So we are going to take a short break here and return to continue the second segment of our program, managing changes in the new learning environment, but focusing on the future perspectives with Mr. Jelani Payne and our educational strategist here, Mr. Dwayne Matthews. So we'll be right back.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to welcome those who just hopped onto the stream, and also thank you to those who have stayed on the stream with us. So you're viewing episode 4 of the EdTech Spots STEM in Education series, and we invite you to be a part of this discussion within the comments and the chat section. Okay, now we're going to dive further into the topic of managing changes in new learning environment, future perspectives. So I'm here talking to Mr. Dwayne Matthews, Chief Innovation Evangelist and Future of Education Strategist. Dwayne, someday we're going to have to talk about how and where those titles came from. I love them. Every time I read them, they're quite interesting. And we're going to, Dwayne has helped educators and parents understand new and evolving themes in the 21st century, the future of work, and how to help prepare children to thrive in a rapidly evolving digital information world. So, Dwayne, welcome to the EdTech Spot. Great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, Jonathan briefly mentioned Dwayne's Trinidadian roots and family and so on. And so I think that this is a great place to jump into the first question. Dwayne, what have you noticed about the Caribbean and its response to education, within the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so thanks a bunch for that. We talk a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago. I was born in Toronto and spent a couple of years in Toronto and went back to Trinidad and Tobago till I was about 14. And then I came back to Toronto. So a lot of my formative years are in Trinidad. I have a huge affiliation to the island, and probably in my mind feel a little bit more Trinidadian than I do feel Canadian. But that's another conversation. In terms of how the Caribbean has responded, I think the Caribbean has responded very similar to a lot of countries around the world. I don't think the response has been slower. I think it's been quite a huge shock to the system. There was a debate happening in education around the world as to analog versus digital, screen versus not screen. I think that debate is probably coming to a close. We will find, people that will relate to the normalcy bias and hope for a return to how things were. You'll hear people talking about going back to school and back to normal. We're not going back anywhere. We actually can't go backwards in time. We're going to have to go forward. And so because we're going forward, we're going to have to think about how do we manage the downside of going forward, and how do we maximize the upside and opportunities of that upside. The biggest challenge that we're going to have is how do we personalize learning at scale. And so one of the things that we've attempted to do is we've created factory-like school systems that really place people into factory-like work environments. And we're seeing that the future of work is here, and it's starting to look a lot more on demand. And so how do we start to prepare our school systems for that? We know in Trinidad, for example, we have a common entrance system. We've now called it the SEA, that kids write when they're 11 to get into higher education. The elephant in the room is that, those education exams probably give the best level of education to about 10 or 20%, depending on the island that you're in. And we don't do as good a job as educating the other 80 or 90%. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we maximize human capital? So how do we go and capture a lot more of that other 80 to 90%? And so we're going to have to switch a lot of the systems, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, where did we get these systems to begin with? And are they the best systems for the outcomes that we want?
Solid points there, Dwayne. What we're really doing here is building a case. And Jonathan would have mentioned this in previous discussions where yourself, myself, and Jonathan would have sat together. And Jonathan really recognized your focus, building that case. And so that's what we're doing with these questions. So moving on to the second question here, which is very inclusive. What approach should stakeholders take regards to this new environment? And when I say stakeholders, I'm talking about public and private stakeholders. So for example, public being the government, and public educators or public school educators. And then you have, on the other hand, private institutions, private schools, even homeschooling, for example, which I know you do a little bit of. And then you also have private educators. Also on the private side is still parents and students. Yeah. So again, what approach should these individuals or these stakeholders, these institutions take, given this new learning environment?
Sure. So I think there's two approaches. I mean, one, right now we are attempting to change the wings on a plane while it's in the air. And so that's a very, very difficult thing for us to do. So there are going to be some immediate things that we need to do to make sure that the plane doesn't crash. And I think most places around the world are doing that now. You're going to see different versions of, online learning. People are going to flirt with the idea of synchronous, asynchronous. There's going to be a challenge of connectivity, which is not unique to the Caribbean in of itself. I mean, here in Toronto, there's an issue, probably about 25,000 kids that don't have connectivity or devices in the city. So going to have to deal with that. But as we start to deal with that, we're going to have to start to look at connectivity and access to a device very much like access to a book. And so once upon a time, books were only accessible to the very wealthy, and only a handful of people read. And once we took that piece of cutting edge technology and we made it more broadly accessible, we have a much more robust world and a lot more productivity. So we're going to have to look at devices and connectivity in the exact same way. And we have a lot of opportunities to do that on the planet. There's a massive amount of electronic waste in terms of devices. So we don't have a problem with being able to give everyone devices. We have a distribution problem, and we're going to have to get much, much better at thinking about how we solve that distribution problem. So that would be thing number one. Thing number two, I think as educators and as countries, we would really have to get a really clear sight on the fourth industrial revolution. What are the potentials of that fourth industrial revolution, and how do we start to prepare students for that fourth industrial revolution? So what is the impact? What is the potential impact? So a lot of people have a conversation and say, we really can't predict the future. And I would agree, but I would say that, we're not completely blind. Because of the speed of computer processing and computer storage, typically doubling at about every 18 to 24 months, we can start to have some ideas as to what is possible. And so we realize that the massive amount of information is really going to have to be a blend of classical Jean Piaget-like thinking, and how do we then go and take these digital tools and help to personalize? So how do we start thinking and learning about learning, and thinking about the content, maybe not as number one, but as number two, because the content will change and our ability to see things will change. So I think that's a great place for us to start. Once we understand what the goals are, again, we go through a process of then identifying what the challenges are, identifying what the root causes of those challenges are, and then creating strategies to go out as small experiments and saying, how can we go out and create these experiments moving forward?
Dwayne, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I do think that we're trying to do too many things simultaneously. So simultaneously, we're trying to deal with the impact of the pandemic. Simultaneously, we're trying to deal with the fact that, okay, we cannot run things with schools as usual at the school plant. And we're dealing with the fallout from that in many different areas as it relates to the educational institutions, as it relates to the persons who work in the institutions, as it relates to the stakeholders like the parents and the students. We're dealing with quite a bit. And, in that vein, I really do believe we're trying to do too many things at once. You use the analogy of trying to change the wings of an airplane while it's in the air. The same analogy you used earlier in terms of the Titanic. Well, there are similar analogies. Funny enough, which make me question if you were an engineer in a previous life, because these analogies are technical. I'm loving it, but it's what I see also. I cannot speak for Jonathan, but based on the conversations we've had, we're seeing those same things, rather than persons actually saying, okay, the entire apple cart, to use a Caribbean type analogy, the entire apple cart has been upset. Okay, let's take our time, and rather than just pick up the apples off the ground, right? What really should we be doing next to ensure that it doesn't happen again, or in order to prepare so that we can prevent against something like that happening again, or for any type of future event? Obviously, we can't prevent against everything, but at the same time, there's still things that we can, press pause and say, all right, let's think on this. Let's take a little time. I don't know. I think maybe the world has a problem, taking some time.
Well, it's funny that you would say that, but it seems that it's forced upon us, right? We were all in lockdown. We all got extremely reflective, and I think it's two challenges that we can separate. The first challenge is, the pandemic itself, and how do we respond to the pandemic? I think the pandemic is, as sad as it is, has created an opportunity for us to have this reflection and think about, how do we move forward? What does forward look like? And what are the opportunities with moving forward? And what does that future space or future state look like? We're in a current state, and what does the future state look like? So there are a lot of things in our overall society that, this is, some people call it the great pause. It's almost like the great reorganization, where we start thinking about, how do we reorganize all of the systems around us, and are those systems in the right place, and what are the key things for us to reach out and shift, and where are the key opportunities? And I think the key opportunity really comes down to looking at some of the assumptions that we have around education, and how do we change those assumptions. So if we can assume that a formal education system is to really create contributing members of society, then we should start thinking about what kind of society do we want, and what kind of tools do we have to address that. You know, when my parents thought about this, the tools were a lot less. They had to wholeheartedly rely on very, very knowledgeable teachers and access to a certain amount of books and going to a particular school. Now, if you can imagine, if someone has internet access, they can access Harvard X courses right now. They can access university courses from all around the world right now. They can access teachers on YouTube right now. There are a lot of different things. There was another conversation that I had with folks from the Caribbean, and I was looking at all the tools that they were using, and they're the same tools that we have access to here in Toronto, right? Which was not the case when I was a child. When I left Trinidad and Tobago, I left for educational access, and now it's quite possible for me to have that access right in the Caribbean. Sitting, I visited my mom at Christmas time in Tobago, and I was working from the beach in Pigeon Point because there was Wi-Fi on the beach, which is a lot more advanced than here in Toronto. There's no Wi-Fi at the lake. And so I realized that, there is sort of a gatekeeper breakdown, and that creates a lot of opportunities for us to sit down and start to reimagine keystone habits that we have. And so we have some keystone habits in the Caribbean around our education system, some hard questions that we have to ask ourselves. Where did this system come from? And is it giving us the best outcome that we want to maximize our citizens and our children?
Solid points. And that's where here at the EdTech Spot, we've really tried to design these series, or rather this series, around sharing such content with educators as it relates to the opportunities and so on. Because I do agree with you, and my colleague Jonathan would as well. There's significant opportunities, and we're really and truly, we're just here to share them. With that note on that point, I wish to make the audience specifically aware that our Q&A section is coming up shortly. It's going to occur after our next two questions that are posed to Mr. Matthews. So please have your questions prepared for Mr. Matthews and Mr. Monerville, and keep them brief as well as succinct. Thank you. All right, Dwayne, continuing to build our case here for the future. Now, we've shared quite a bit so far. We've discussed quite a bit, but you hit on something. And this is why I really say, my goodness, you must be an engineer in a previous life, because it's like I'm talking to a colleague engineer, because your thought process is on, okay, let's actually break this problem down into, rather than its complex parts, its more simple parts into simple version. And then, okay, let's see what it is that is actually causing the problem. Let's deal with that. And then look at, okay, are there any other places that have done better in this problem? Are there any other solutions that have already been implemented? Okay, so my question to you is, what core physical and mental elements truly essential for students to learn? For example, do these elements still require that traditional school plan that teachers go to? Do we still require that in-person educational style?
So that's a great question. And so I'll go back to a question that I've asked myself at the beginning of the pandemic. And I have parents that live in Tobago, and I realized that, in the Caribbean, we do not have a pharma company that is out there trying to develop a vaccine. And so I asked myself, why? Why don't we have that? And particularly in Trinidad's case, Trinidad has a lot of natural resources. So it's not an issue of being able to generate money. It's an issue of why. Why don't we have that? And so when I start thinking about that, I think, well, it's not the citizens themselves. We have lots of brilliant Caribbean people all over the world. One of the best oncologists in the world is Dr. Wayne Frederick, who's Trinidadian. Some of the best executives on the planet are from the Caribbean, all across the Caribbean. Some of the, even one of the Canadian billionaires is Jamaican. I go, so we have a lot of really sharp people coming out of the Caribbean doing fantastic things all over the world. And we've done a great job at exporting so much of our culture for such a small space all over the world to have a very profound impact on the world. And so I asked myself, well, why not here? And so one of the big challenges I think was in the past was access, right? We had our system essentially maximized education opportunity for about 10%. Most of the islands only had space for about 1%, and we exported a lot of brain power out into, whether it be England or the United States or Canada. And so, I am a product of that, and many of my classmates are a product of that. And so I started thinking, okay, well, what happens if we don't have to do that? What happens if we have access sitting right at home in the Caribbean, right in Barbados? We were joking on a conversation before, if I could come and set up there. I know that Barbados has a work for a year, visa. I think other Caribbean islands may be looking at doing that as well. But really to start to think about, okay, what access do we need if we have access to all the information? So before I didn't have access, if I needed to find out about a topic, I'm seeing the encyclopedias in the back behind you there. I had to make sure that there were encyclopedias. I had, I think, A to D, and I had some friends down the street that had some other letters. And that was the best way for us to find that information. Now we can find that information digitally across the World Wide Web, almost all of the information. So what's the challenge at hand? The challenge at hand is being able to separate what is essential learning from random content and what is essential thinking. How do we learn how to learn so we can access more of that information? And how do we personalize that? And that personalized learning comes in a very different way at the beginning. We have an addiction to content where we have our kids try to memorize as much content as possible, and we have them, essentially try to compete with the computer. But we know from science that we don't remember most of it, right? Most of what we remember out of school is somewhere around 25%. And so we're going to go and access our devices to get to the rest. So how do we maximize that accessing to our device? We have to maximize learning how to learn. We have to maximize mental frameworks. How do we create mental frameworks? So we have them like utility tools to be able to access information. You talked a lot about engineering, and I have a lot of respect for engineers, and I think it's quite a compliment that you said that you thought that I might have been an engineer, because I never thought I was smart enough to even take on the topic. I have a high regard for engineers. But how do you use certain mental frameworks? So one of the mental frameworks, an example, is design thinking. How do you use design thinking to access problems and access challenges? And you can use that. How do you empathize? How do you define your problem? How do you ideate and brainstorm on that problem? How do you create prototypes to do that? And how do you have action then to go about and maximize on the action and to iterate? The other is the idea of the MVP, the most viable product. So when I went to school, our assessment was based on, how perfect could I be at the time of assessment, as opposed to thinking, okay, how do we try things? How do we understand that making mistakes are a part of that process, and iteration is a part of that process as well? So how do we build that in to learning? So as opposed to thinking I have to study, I have to remember as much as possible on an exam, I'm only going to remember 25% of it in about 5 days, and moving on and pretending like I'm going to remember all of it, to think about, okay, how do I look at a particular situation? How do I think solutions-based? And now once I have my solutions-based, I start making small iterations and building up to that. And so that leads back to my pharma question, right? Why do we not have a vaccine-making company in the dogfight? And so it really comes down to thinking about solutions-based problem solving, personalized learning, and learning how to learn, and then going out and using the technological tools to help to augment us to do that.
So at this point, we want to come in for that knockout question, that question that we were purposely building this case with everything before, even from Mr. Chad Monerville, where he came in and talked about where we are at present, potential policies, that type of thing, what we're really dealing with here in Barbados and the wider Caribbean, as well as yourself talking about the future. Okay, so well, actually, you know what? Let's take a different tack. There's something that I've heard you mention significantly, and I love it. It's actually on your website. Are we preparing students for 2019 or 2030? I'm going to say that again so everyone can hear, not just Dwayne really here, but everyone who is at home, everyone who's listening. Are we preparing students for 2019 or 2030? The other question, or rather the other question that he had brought up himself, something that he posed to himself, and really made me think as well, and I think should make everyone who's listening and watching think, why do we not have any company within the Caribbean that is in a dogfight for a vaccine? Dwayne just mentioned that in his answer. Now, coming in for that knuckle question, well, then what approach should stakeholders, and these are our private and public institutions, our public and private educators, our parents and students, what approach should they then take to be prepared for the future of the Caribbean?
So I think, there are a few things. If you would take something classical, Jean Piaget, inquiry-based learning, and then you were to think about the technological tools that you have to maximize and optimize that would be the approach that I would take. I would really look at how do we blend inquiry-based with the types of technological tools that we have. And once you do that, lots of opportunities start to formulate and create themselves. The other is to think about, 2019 or 2030, where would we like to be? How do we create a non-political vision of where the Caribbean can be in 10 to 20 years? And 10 to 20 years doesn't seem like a long time. People say it seems very short. Doing this will happen in a lifetime. But if you can think that it took 150 years between the Gutenberg printing press and the Gutenberg Bible, it took 2006 for the first iPhone. Now we're at iPhone 12 that has 11.3 billion transistors and 5G capability in a couple of days. That's very, very fast. So we can see that the opportunity and potential is moving exponentially. And I think if we take that approach and we break the approach down, instead of thinking of one standardized ship, but we break that approach down into goals and then break it into smaller fragmented pieces, moving towards those goals, we're going to start to find, we're going to see opportunities where before there were none. And I think that's very, very exciting to me. I think the other approach is to look at post-secondary and assessment. If we can look at post-secondary and think about what is post-secondary, post-secondary is the bridge between school and employment. So if we can think of, instead of thinking of post-secondary as the end of school, if we can think of post-secondary as something that's going to be consistent, then we start to have a different approach in terms of speed, right? Our speed and our urgency changes, because instead of going from school and going all the way to the end of school and post-secondary and then going to your real life and to work, you can think in terms of learn, engage, learn, engage, learn, engage, which creates a lot more opportunities for us to be able to do extraordinary things. And I think that is one of the big pieces. The other is to really focus in and think of, our human capital is a massive untapped resource. If we've been maximizing only 10 to 20% of the population, and if let's say it's 10%, exporting 9 of that, with maybe 1 or 2 returning, we can realize that there's a huge opportunity. Michael Lee Chen once said to me, he said, if you find that there is a lot of inefficiency, If you can make that inefficiency more efficient, there's a massive amount of opportunity. And so to me, I think the real opportunity for the Caribbean is the inefficiency that's there in terms of the education system creates a massive amount of opportunity for upside. Massive. I can't stress that enough. How much opportunity I think the Caribbean is probably about 10 to 11 million people. And if you can think about what I mentioned, small islands broken up into small different spaces with a lot of brain power. I mean, I think, just to give an example, Nevis, which is probably one of the smallest countries in the Caribbean, has one of the highest literacy rates in the world. These are profound pieces that we have in the Caribbean, and I think just a small shift in terms of vision allows us to think about, okay, this is what we can go out to do as individual stakeholders. So to answer, how do we personalize learning at scale is what we need to do. In the Caribbean, we have a system that's based on a British system that's designed very specifically for a British 20th century society. And so now how do we start thinking about personalizing that at scale and looking at some of our opportunities? And the last thing I would say is this. One of the largest companies in the world today is a company called Uber. And in Trinidad, where I'm from, we have taxis, and the taxis have a H to let you know that it's hired, and a private car is P. And if you are illegally driving a taxi with your P car, call that pull and bull. If you think of Uber essentially took pulling bull, and instead of it being all over, they basically centralized the most difficult part, which is how do you exchange the money safely? And it's $1 billion company with a Caribbean idea. So think of all the ideas that we have, all the problems that we've already solved as people of the Caribbean, and then think about how do we take the technology and how do we export that, right? Well, we have to unlock our children. We have to unlock them from thinking that the best way for them to be, successful is to navigate all the way through to a terminal degree. And how do they start taking that learning that they know how to do already and bringing back to the forefront and applying that to technology?
Solid points, Dwayne. I agree with you as it relates to there's massive opportunity. I think that's why Jonathan would have founded the STEM in education, the EdTech spot, and therefore then built out this STEM in education series. What's really interesting to me is observing how people see what is happening around them, where many persons are seeing the problems as opposed to the opportunities. Now, I think for myself, that alone tells me quite a bit about our education system. Tells me a lot, loads, a ridiculous amount. I think the next thing is that teaching, or rather training students how to learn, preparing them for 2030 rather than 2019 is not something that's just important. It's something that's necessary. And I think on a third and final area that I'll speak on, how Dwayne persons typically say, hopefully the next Google can come out of the Caribbean. Well, given what you just said, which I know I've heard before, the great joke is, or rather the question really is, how many Googles have come out of the Caribbean that we do not recognize, that we've given away and not monetized? All right. I can't get too deep because if I do, we'll go down another rabbit hole. We'll be here forever. I can't do it to the viewers. I won't. Jonathan will kill me and everyone backstage. But okay, so we're going to move on to our question and answer segment at this point. So at this time, we revert to the audience regarding any questions that they might have for Mr. Dwayne Matthews here and Mr. Chad Monerville. So, Jonathan, you know what we usually say here.
Yes.
Hopefully, the next question, I'll leave that to you because that's your tagline. You go ahead.
Yes. Well, I just want to encourage everyone. If you have any questions, feel free to get your thoughts together, get your fingers ready, and start posting those in the live chat. No, it wasn't open before, but it is open now, so you can begin typing away there. All right. Um, Good evening to you too, Mr. Anderson Cave. We're glad to have you watching. Hopefully, you can post your questions so we can answer them. I'm sure our guests will be happy to respond to them. Um, Before, we've mentioned about capacity building and providing some sense of support to our educators. And Jalan and I have been involved that outside of the EdTech spot as well in the Google Educators group for Barbados and the Caribbean. And we're now linking with another group called GEG Bermuda. And there are many GEG groups all around the world you can join. If you're not within the Caribbean region, you can join those GEG groups as well. So feel free to join any of the Google Educator groups, which is your professional learning network. We want all of the educators, all of our ICT specialists, or anyone who's interested in education or helping and supporting each other to join this group to lend some much needed support. Now, I have a question here for Chad, just to give him a chance to respond to this. Chad, elected officials often like to see project success within election cycles, but because it is that is when they hold the most power and influence. All right, given that there is no telling if the next administration will continue the said policies, and many of the desired outcomes or impacts are only realized like years after the project is completed. What should be our approach to transformation in education at small island developing states?
Thanks very much for the question, Jonathan. It's an excellent question. When it comes to policy, I like to look at policy not in a very myopic view, but certainly from how do we bring a global perspective and apply it into a local context. And therefore, I premise my remarks simply to say that this is nothing new. When you look at countries like Finland, who've done extensive work in education, you would see the studies there have clearly indicated some of the challenges. And one of the challenges is actually what you pointed out, and that's the reason I smile. Because yes, elective officials like to say, well, I like this and I did this and so on and so forth. But the reality is education, it is a continuum. It's like a government. Government administrations is a continuum. And therefore, I think it would be the wrong approach to say that perhaps we're going to look to do it in the 5 years or the 10 years you're in office, because you need to be conscious of the fact that it will continue and it will continue to impact lives. Education is one of the things, and I like speaking on it because it's one of the things really and truly that can literally transform lives and can transform industries and transform economies, quite frankly. And therefore, perhaps the view must be shared that it is not a matter of the case that, well, this project was completed during my tenure, but to say that this project was started and this project continued, and we can see the impact 5, 10, 15 years from now when we have young Barbadians and young CARICOM citizens who are well equipped to continue taking global positions and continue leading the country. Our Prime Minister today, the Honorable Mayor Motley, says it quite well, that we want to create Barbadian citizens with a global impact, but are rooted in Barbados. And to have that global impact, you need to make sure that your citizens in Barbados and across CARICOM are well equipped for the 21st century and the globalized environment. So, to be succinct and to land the plane, I would simply say that we need to make sure that we operate very much utilizing global policy and adapting towards a local context. And we don't get tied up in the partisan views and so on and so forth, but understand that education is something that can literally make or break countries, make or break economies, and make and break livelihoods.
Yes, I totally agree. We often say on the EdTech spot that efficacy must come before speed when dealing with education and transformation. I see Dwayne leaping forward at first. I'm not sure if you want to respond to this question as well. I know you have a lot to say on it, so I'm going to give you a chance to respond.
Sure, and thanks a lot. And I really want to say how much I enjoyed Chad's comments. Chad, I think your comments are spot on. You took a mention to Finland. A lot of people look at the miracle of Finland's education system sitting on the top of the PISA. But they started. I think it was 19 in the 1970s. They started to think about transforming their education. It took them about 40 years to become an overnight success. That's really important. But I think we should also look at some of the other countries that have done fantastic jobs in education, and not that everything is going to match or that we can follow, but there are some examples. Qatar is an example of in a generation. Singapore is an example in a generation. A lot of the work that they're doing in Rwanda. Rwanda started their journey like in 1997. Before that, they really suffered with the civil war and the genocides that happened there. And if you look at, Rwanda's goal is very simple: to become the Singapore of Africa. And they're doing everything in their power to do that. So I think there are examples of places. Now, some of those places are not democracies. So we do have to take that into consideration, but we should think about what are some of the pieces or what are some of the things that they've done to bring about that kind of change. And another example that I can think of is South Korea. They've done a fantastic job in terms of, even though they went to one regime over the next, taking over the next, they were still able to hold one direction in terms of Kia, in terms of Hyundai, in terms of education. So what can we learn from those places and bring that into a Caribbean context? And the other thing that I think is important when we think about the opportunity is to realize that this is a Wizard of Oz moment. Almost every country on the planet is having this discussion, and nobody has it nailed. A lot of people, when I was young, we came to North America and we thought, North America has it nailed. I'm sitting here in Toronto and we don't have it nailed. We haven't sorted this out. In the United States, they haven't sorted it out. And these are great, big systems. The Toronto District School Board is 260,000 students. And there are 2 million students in Ontario. So when you think about moving 2 million students, how do you do that? It's going to take a really long time. So the opportunity, I think, is for the Caribbean is its size. And as Chad mentioned, making sure that it's not a partisan view, make sure that it's a vision view. They should sit outside of the regular politics day, and to think about, how does Barbados as a country become that impactful? How does the next Uber come out of the Caribbean? And I think the other is to bring in the voice of the youth. A lot of times, at least in Trinidad, I see a lot of the people. They're people that consider me youth, and I'm really old. I have people that have kids that are youth, right? So not to, and the reason why I make that joke is because a lot of the people that are in charge, I think it's time for them to give a little bit more voice, a lot more voice, or to allow a lot more voice from the youth, because I think a lot of the creativity that the islands need already exists. I just think that the people that are the most creative don't have a voice. I think there's some fantastic work that I see coming out of the Caribbean, and I think people would be blown away, surprised if a lot more of that voice gets to hit the main stage.
Yes, we agree. There needs to be some sort of inclusivity, especially for persons who have the ideas and may not have access to the funding or even the technical assistance that will help propel them. There are a lot of lead users within our education system as well who already have the ideas and to solve the problems that they experience. But as you said, they need that voice, and we totally agree with you. And another point, it is really more important for us to get this right than to get it fast within our education system. So we should take our times. Now, Dwayne, we acknowledge that these are stressful times for our educators, parents, and policymakers. But you have a coping mechanism that I think can help some of us to relieve this stress. I've heard you mention this before, and I love it. Smell the strawberries, blow out the candle. What does this mean? You can explain to our viewers. What does this mean?
So thanks a bunch for asking that question. One of the things that in my former life that I did was I did a little bit of work at a neuroscience lab out of the University of Montreal called the Faubert Institute, and I worked with Dr. Faubert, and a lot of the work was around executive functioning and looking at things like prefrontal cortex and the limbic system and how we respond to that. And we realized that a big part of that work is creating a certain amount of calm to be able to process faster and to be able to process wider. And so mindfulness is a really big part of that. I don't see mindfulness as a nice to have. I think in the world of information where it's growing exponentially, we need to have a lot of mindfulness implemented. And the reason that we need to do that is there's a lot of science behind mindfulness and our ability to actually think and to stay in the prefrontal cortex as we're thinking. And also thinking about how do we speed up our ability to process. There's a whole other conversation that I could have around video games and screen time. And how do we maximize that opportunity while we manage the downside of that? But smelling the strawberries and blowing out the candles is something that I've taught my son to do, and it really is the beginning of mindfulness. And how do we observe ourselves as the observer? And it allows us to think and process information a lot more efficiently.
Great. I've definitely used that before, just let you know, and it has worked in terms of need. So thank you very much for introducing me to that. I want to thank you, Mr. Matthews and Mr. Chad Monerville, for taking time out to be a part of this show today. We really appreciate it. And if you want to reach out to any of our guests, feel free to follow them on social media using their social media handles that will be made available to you. So thank you once again to Chad Monerville and to Mr. Dwayne Matthews. I'm hoping that we can have this conversation again in the near future. So thank you once again for being here, guys.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thank you, Dwayne.
Thank you for having me, guys.
So if you want to join this experience, feel free to fill out our feedback form. We'll be happy to discuss this further with you. We've come to the end of this episode and would encourage you to look out for our next episode. Now, Jonathan knows, he knows. And that's why I jumped onto this. So, STEM and Education, episode 5 in this series will focus on my favorite subject, robotics. Now, in episode 5, we'll dive into the what, the how, and the why of robotics in education.
Yes, that is definitely something to look forward to. And as always, we invite you to subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with all of the happenings on the EdTech Spot. Thank you once again for watching. And until next time, be safe.